Everybody, welcome to this week's Colloquium, Topos Institute Colloquium. It's lovely to see you all on a beautiful day here in Oxford. I'm very happy to introduce Kate Fleming today, who's speaking from IDEMS. IDEMS are a community interest company based here in the UK, with whom we've been in pretty close collaboration for a while. So it's fantastic to have Kate here. And she's today going to be talking about Beyond Tech Solutionism, the challenges of unlocking underserved community knowledge for scale social impact. So Kate's going to give her talk. We'll have questions at the end in the last 5-10 minutes, as per usual. If you have any questions during the talk, please feel free to drop them in the chat, and I will try to pass them over to Kate. So Kate, please, whenever you're ready.
Hi, everyone. Yes, I will say that Brendan and Tim asked me here as I think bringing quite a different perspective. So yeah, I think I pack a lot in, mainly because there's a lot to share about what gets me to my very different perspective and how that becomes intersectional with mathematical thinking and mathematicians. So yeah, diving right in, I think, except none of my slides just aren't rotating. Technical difficulties almost immediately. Here we go. Okay. So first of all, just like a brief snapshot of my background that's relevant. I started with the work that's relevant is that I started as a digital agency owner where I was launching and scaling VC-funded tech. While I was doing that work, I helped found or build a pro bono legal anti-trafficking resource and community. Out of that, I founded a startup, Horizontl, which I will get to and dive into deeply. And from there, I joined IDEMS, which is where I'm right now, and the perspective I will bring to this presentation as we progress through this. So to get into the sex work topic and trafficking, which I was told by Tim I should not put in the title because it might get us blocked in various places. But that is when we're looking at human trafficking, it very much relates to sex work, consensual sex work, exploitation, and trafficking. There's a spectrum. It's not very neat binaries. So the starting point for this is Fosta Sesta, which I think if you're in the US, you probably have heard of. If you're in the UK, perhaps not. But the basic thing is Fosta Sesta is the one exception to Section 230, which is the law in the US that makes platforms not accountable for user content. So Fosta Sesta makes tech platforms, tech companies accountable for anything that might be exploitation, trafficking, and specifically sex related, not exploitation, labor exploitation in the broader sense. It's very focused on sex. So sex workers are immediately up in arms. This is going to cause all kinds of harms. They see it almost immediately cause harms. They're blocked, they're banned, their payments platforms are shut down. These are already people who are working in hardship. And so there are a lot of protests, but they're considered a quite marginalized fringe community. And I don't know that this really enters into the mainstream in the way that it should. It's very clear, researchers from research, that this is not good. It creates all kinds of new harms, creates dangers. You know, it's well documented among researchers. And so I ended up getting very interested because I'm sitting in this intersectional place where I'm working with tech companies, I'm working on this anti-trafficking platform. I got really interested in this as a topic. What is this connection? And I will say I'm going to leap to the UK here and actually leap around a little bit between the US and the UK. And a lot of that has to do with where I decided to launch this, which has to do with legality and where you could actually do this, but also sometimes where data is. It's pretty much the case broadly that there is terrible data, and I will get into why that is, and I'm sure you could probably figure it out. But this is a massive community. There are lots of sex workers globally. 40 million is the estimated number. There are 70 to 100,000 workers in the UK. Despite a lot of the messaging that we get around it, they're mostly consensual adults. They're mostly also poor. They're marginalized. I think there's sometimes the story of the sort of escort, fancy, that view of sex work. This is actually not the case. It's mostly people working out of financial hardship. I will also make a distinction here that this is very focused on prostitution. So there are other kinds of sex work, but this is where people face danger because they are working in physical proximity, in privacy with a client. In the UK, you find that most sex workers say that they're working to pay for household expenses, for children. It's just cost of living. Sex work is legal in the UK, so it is legal to both buy and sell sexual services. 11% of British men, which is 2.3 million men, self-report as having paid for sex in their lifetimes. I suspect that means the number is a little bit higher, but who knows? But the majority of clients are non-abusive. And also this number about the size of this economy, that it's estimated to contribute 5 to 8 billion pounds annually, I think is insane. So it's this massive underground economy. But everyone seeks underground anonymity to protect themselves from shame and stigma, from unwanted interventions. There's a lot of rescue culture where people are just trying to make a living, and from punishment and criminalization. Even where it's legal, you'll see a lot of this at the street level. There's a lot of intervention and yeah, just criminalizing people. So here's the data that exists on this, and you'll see like the rates of violence, of exploitation, they're much higher than the general population and then most other kinds of work. The other thing I mentioned before is that trafficking and debt bondage are the most extreme forms of exploitation. So when you actually look at most trafficking, it's often that somebody consented to sex work early, but didn't consent to be in a non-consensual working arrangement. But because they're underground, because they're usually marginalized, they end up in exploitative circumstances that they can't get out of. And now there's an accidental intervention. So it turns out that tech and the internet actually made sex work way safer. So through the internet, you can have workers and clients connect without punishment. Workers can work independently. And the big one is that work moves indoors. So before, you had to go to someone's car, you had to be out in public somewhere and make the connection that way. Now you can have the intermediary of the internet before you ever have to meet someone in person. And there's this crazy statistic out of the US, which is these economists did a bunch of research of various variables and concluded that the introduction of Craigslist erotic services, which is a marketplace for sexual services, reduced the rate of all female homicides in the US by 17.4%, which I find just a mind-boggling statistic. But tech wasn't actually designed to be an intervention. So you have traffickers who are advertising, who can stay ahead of the police. You have abusive and violent clients who can reoffend and don't ever get caught. And then you have plausible deniability for platforms that they can just say, we can't really know, we don't know what's going on, we don't have a way to shut this down. And so there's a backlash. And so you have legitimate anti-trafficking concerns, and then you have this sort of moral hysteria. So there's this very just universally shut it all down, and that leads to FOSTA SESTA. But the big problem is that tech isn't built to distinguish consent from exploitation. And what it does know actually is about sex workers' behaviors, all the things that platforms are gathering where they're gaining visibility into who people are, but they're not actually getting relevant information. So you have mass data collection. That data is processed with completely black box, unaccountable algorithms. And then you have authoritarian, unaccountable governance. So what happens is that sex workers are just increasingly kicked offline, and you see particularly sex workers from marginalized groups are profiled and blocked, banned, and it's really difficult for them to stay ahead of what platforms are doing. Oh, that's my next slide. So they get blocked and banned. A thing that happens a lot is sex workers will try to keep their real ID separate from their sex worker ID, but because platforms are, it's like the big data machine, they often get conflated, they get brought together, and so sex workers will have their real world accounts, profiles, bank accounts shut down, which means the people who are already in financial hardship are further pushed into financial hardship. They're marginalized. They're excluded from basically societal participation. And through this all, really, there are no cases of trafficking victims or traffickers trafficking victims being, I guess there are some cases of trafficking victims being rescued, but not because of FOSTA SESTA, because of dogged law enforcement kind of tracking things down. But no traffickers have been prosecuted. And I will say, if you're paying attention to this, you really see that sex workers are the canaries in the coal mine for things that we're seeing with tech now, with what big tech can do about censoring certain groups, certain ideas, the myth of free speech. It's basically like, well, what aligns with the vision of the platform, basically leadership team and funders. So yeah, that brings us to the problem. I'll stay focused on sex work, which is, if you're looking just at the individual level, and if you're looking at trafficking and exploitation, what you really have is an accountability problem. So if you're a sex worker, you have very little way of knowing in any systemic way who's a good actor and who's violent or abusive. So there might only be one bad apple in the barrel, but you have no idea how to identify that person or avoid them. And you also have no way of holding them. If you do have a bad experience, you have no way of holding someone to account because your relationship with law enforcement is adversarial. You mostly experience the systems that could help you as things that will come after you, not after the person who's offended. I will say that's not universally true, but it's hard to know who to trust. On the client side, you actually see that clients, I think sometimes there's a sense that clients wouldn't be as concerned with this, but actually clients are quite concerned. They don't want to be with someone underage. They don't want to be with someone trafficked. They're already undertaking risky, reputationally risky behavior. Most of them are not eager to extend that. And then the other layer is, if you look at police, if you look at tech platforms, if you look at NGOs, they don't know how to direct their resources. So there's a lot of wasted energy on intervening with people who don't want to be taken out of sex work. They just want rights and protections and like access to the law. And at the same time, actual trafficking victims it's impossible to know where to find them. And you can't access community networks of knowledge where, you might begin to know, like the people who are on the ground might be noticing something that's amiss, but because it's so adversarial and because there's this hostile relationship, that information all just kind of gets lost in the ether. So this brought me to Horizontl, which is really based on all of this evidence for what works and what doesn't. And so what's not working in tech is unchecked anonymity. You have completely unaccountable tech platforms, and surveillance really just becomes the assumption of how you address harms. And if you look at sex work, what's really needed is privacy, which doesn't mean that you have anonymity, but it means you get to keep a lot of information out of the public sphere, out of law enforcement hands, away from platforms. You have reliable access to platforms, so they become institutions, they become things that are accountable, that you know that you will continue to be able to do work on. And finally, you have just basic protections, the things that most of us take for granted in our workplaces, where you're not going to be assaulted, harassed, experience violence, have your, income stolen from you, all of those issues. So Horizontl is conceived as a contracts and compliance platform for authorized sex workers and clients based on the verification of government issued ID and consent and non-abusive behavior. I'm sure you immediately say that and think like, how do you unlock that? And I would say, I can get into that a bit more, but it's not just a technology problem, it's a social problem too, and how you do things offline. I think we've come to see, like, if something is tech, it has to be all tech, where actually what you see is tech can get you to a certain place, but often you want to use offline networks, offline trust, offline communities. So authorized participants, they meet community standards to be authorized, and they maintain compliance with community standards for consensual, non-abusive participation. So they're not exploitative, they're paying, they're, consenting, all of those things that right now are not seen. So it enables trusted, accountable private exchange. So you have peer-to-peer connection, you have peer-to-peer contract negotiation under universal standards, and then individual booking terms. Eventually, the goal is to get into cryptographically protected payments with real-time auditing. I will say this is not a technology problem. This is a policy problem where there's an assumption that I think we all should possibly take issue with, that we have no privacy in our payments, that can all be audited. What happens in our bank accounts is pretty much public information, not public, it is accessible information. And actually the auditing that happens is horrible and bad, and nothing much is coming of it. So there's a lack of privacy, but also it's not serving much purpose. And so, yeah, okay. So moving on. The core of this is private. I'm trying to keep, how am I doing time-wise, Tim?
15 minutes.
Okay. I'm on a schedule here. I'm trying to pack a lot in. So a lot of this is about what happens to your real ID, you know, how it gets authorized. How do you not bring things into a centralized system? How do you hold things locally? But when information is needed to be exchanged, it is exchanged peer-to-peer, but also has a point where it's verified. You know, we actually know that that's like legitimate information that's been matched. So I will just, okay, so how does this work? Discovery can happen anywhere. This is really conceived as an infrastructure or kind of an underlying thing that makes this work. So you could meet someone in person, you could meet someone online. It doesn't really matter. This is something that you can use. You vet somebody, you negotiate terms and contracts, then you have your in real life meeting, and both parties verify compliance and reputation. And also there's enforcement of payment and all those things that right now are just left to the individual sex worker. So to do this, you pretty quickly realize that traditional models of business, of the way things are structured for most technology companies don't work. So I ended up breaking out Horizontl, the tech company, as something focused on infrastructure, on innovation, on R&D, but having a whole community nonprofit, because what you see is most of the challenges around community trust, community relationships, bringing community into participation, and then you end up with what is basically a co-designed platform where it's the technology, the core technology is the innovation piece, but community is bringing a lot of the best practices, the lived knowledge, the experiences, all the things that actually make it work. And through this and through any impact project, you end up building these really comprehensive, complex networks of relationships. So a head of community who's a former sex worker, a head of privacy who understands cryptography and security. I end up with this network of sex worker organizations who are all kind of this gateway to connecting with community, individual sex workers. I will say also clients. I would sometimes talk about this and clients would approach me and be very interested in being involved in any way they could, which is a complicated thing because it's how do you prioritize sex workers, but you also need clients to feel like they have a say. And so you have to kind of navigate that piece of it. Anti-trafficking organizations. One of my most interesting relationships was with the former, I think he was the founding lead detective of the modern slavery unit at the Met Police. And then a bunch of researchers who are looking at different areas. So public health researchers, social science researchers, and labor and employment researchers, and even policymakers are interested in this. I think there's a lot of awareness that what's happening isn't working. And one of the things that I see in this is there's so much complexity that has to be held within this single solution. So what works in the UK isn't going to work in France. That isn't just because of laws. It also has to do with what are local cultural practices. You have to give ownership. France doesn't want England saying, well, this is how the platform works and this is what we've decided are the rules. So you need to give each community, and sometimes community is entirely geographic, but even within sex workers, you can have communities of affiliation where what people, what standards are, what good behaviors are can vary. So yeah, to make those, to give that individual variability and ownership, but to have a single system where it's interoperable, because what you often see is that a client will travel to another country and sex workers will travel to another country. So they want to carry their reputation with them. They want to be able to access the same information. And a lot of what this requires, you'll see down on the left, I have a little sidebar. You really have to shift your thinking from your community, which I use community in this way with tech, because community really is just a euphemism for like your consumers or your beneficiaries. They're the people you are acting on, and they don't really have a lot of say except like, do they use it? And is it sticky? Or, those kinds of things that are the determiners of good tech in mainstream situations. This is really like, what does it look like to make users, community really participate and kind of become citizens of the technology, where they see that this is an institution, it's answerable to them, they can direct what happens in it. And I pretty much, so all of this work is happening. And when I try to fundraise, when I try to build like my tech team, you really bump up against tech solutionism, where it's just like, why is this so complicated? This is not how we build tech. You just, you prototype it, you fundraise, you build your MVP, which is the minimum viable product. You go out, you test with users. Is it usable, and do they need it, and do they stay with it? You productize it, you optimize it, just in this single direction, and you replicate at scale. And that is how tech gets built. And which is why I have that meme down in the corner, which I would have these conversations where people would just look at me like I was insane, like I had just introduced so much unnecessary complexity. Like, why would you even bother with that? And then I met these lovely mathematicians, mathematical scientists who did not think this was insane, who were like, I completely get this. And these are hard, interesting problems. Like Sarah, who I met, we went to the same undergrad. I was like, well, I'll just try this and see. And we had a coffee and she was like, I'm in. This is super interesting. Like, I want to work on this. This is a hard problem. And it's a rewarding hard problem. And Gabe is the same thing, where he was talking, we were working on payments and privacy, and he's like, I could totally build this for you, but like, these are policy issues. And so both of them were so collaborative. They were so, they didn't assume that their expertise was something to kind of be pushed on me and like, I've got this, just go away. It was very like working through, well, how would we make this work? How would I work with community? And Sarah would say like, well, I could design it this way, but these are community decisions. And so it was very revealing to me of what it looks like to have computer scientists, mathematical thinking that can sit with the social complexity, the technology challenges, all of those things in collaboration. And then finally, the person who just totally landed in the same place was David Stern. And I'll get into our relationship, but I presented on this, some variation of what I just talked you through. And he was the one person in the audience who was like, oh, I completely get this. Just talking through all the social variables, the need to create different business models, how do you transfer to community ownership, the variability. It was so aligned. And his model was really actually farmers in Africa, where it's like something that I had never thought about, that it could possibly be analogous. And he said, well, they don't need the crazy privacy, but they need a lot of these things about ownership and how do you claw your data back from big tech and surveillance, and build platforms that are accountable and give communities control over data analysis and sense making. So this brings me to the next phase of the story, which is really thinking about what is the broader context for, so Horizontl is in this very narrow space. And in many ways, it's in that narrow space because it was something that I could see, where I didn't have the mathematical thinking, but it was an example that gave me all of the complexity within this very applied experience. But what I see now working with IDEMS, and I'll get into what that is and what we're doing, is that what happens is you have underserved communities globally who really are on the front lines of these grand challenges or wicked problems. So when you look at like the hardest problems, which is sex work, but it's poverty, it's child abuse, it's climate change and climate resilience, the people who are most affected are the most vulnerable, marginalized communities. And so I also, by the way, learned that if you're going to talk about these things, you should reference the UN SDGs, that it gives people grounding. So I will reference these through here because they are relevant. Pretty much all of these development goals have a layer that relates to community and how you address problems in communities globally. And so what you see in an impact example is and this, I think you could look around you and you could see charities that are doing this, that this is kind of just like a global reality. You'll have an evidence-based intervention. It might be a charity, it might be a program, something. And the reason it works locally is community is actually really involved. So you have community adaptation, you have community trusted relationships. And actually what happens is community has a role in sense making. Like, is this working? How could this be better? So they're actually contributing a lot to what that intervention is. And so it becomes this complement or collaboration between someone who really holds the systemic expert knowledge, and communities that hold local knowledge, local best practices, often have lived experiences on the ground that are relevant. And together those come into sort of this collective intelligence innovation. And then you have, if you're really bringing both into collapsing power dynamics to bring both into interaction, you have iterative innovation. You can move researchers programming further forward, and there's all kinds of new energy and impact that comes out of that. And you can see that tech really could scale this, that you could unlock this at scale to have impact in these really hard, wicked problems. But you bump up against a problem. Oh, I think I lost a slide here. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Is that, oh no, I'm telling my story wrong. So what you bump up against is that you have all kinds of complexity. So this is kind of what I just talked you through with Horizontl, is you start to see you have social complexity, you have different policies, laws, cultural practices, all these different things. You have digital complexity. So sometimes things as simple as internet access, devices, digital literacy, and then you get into what platforms do people actually use. A local platform might be different in one place than in another place. You have economic complexity, which is mostly, there's not a lot of extra money, but there's variable, like how much could this cost? And then you have a ton of expertise complexity. I point you back to that slide where I showed everyone who came in as I was working on what I was working on, where you kind of need all these perspectives and relationships and knowledge, and you need all of those to come into working collaboration. But mainstream software is not designed for complexity. Most tech that we know is designed to simplify, homogenize. They're going after a market, high-value users. I would say that even though we're focused on low resource communities, these are also problems for all of us, where our behaviors are channeled based on the interests of tech. So you have things that are built for best case scenarios, connectivity, resources, education, all of those things. They're closed, they're not interoperable, so they're entirely siloed systems because you want to capture all of those behaviors and data and revenue that's possible from your users. All of the incentives of most tech that we experience is driven by profit. So everything that we understand to be like, this is what technology has to look like, is just because people wanted to make money out of us. So, like that is, I think, the biggest variable that gets underestimated in what we experience as technology. It's proprietary. This comes back to the black box algorithms. It's always, well, we don't really know. If we did reveal it to you, we'd be giving away our trade secrets. I think we're seeing this in AI a lot right now. It's like, it's all just kind of like under the hood, and you don't get to know really what's going on. And it's expensive. Like these are high resource countries, mostly out of the US, Europe, where they're expecting customers to pay a lot of money for what these solutions are. And then you have open source, which ideally would be a real alternative, but it's underfunded, it's incomplete. You often have communities that are working where you have high-skilled people, so they're solving similar problems. They're under-maintained, so even when you do opt into an open source thing, the idea that it will continue to keep up with where you need it to be, that's not always a given. And to package anything open source into something that's really usable, you actually end up needing highly skilled users. So it ends up being expensive in its own, highly skilled developers. So it ends up being expensive in its own way. And this means, sorry for this very dense slide, but it means that mostly if you're trying to deploy an impact intervention at scale with technology, it doesn't work. And I list all of these reasons why it doesn't work. Mostly what happens is there's sort of one size fits all solutions. There's this idea of like a silver bullet, or what works in one place doesn't work in another. But what you really see is when you have really sophisticated researchers, they don't even try. Or they're like me, where they naively think, oh, I could get funding for this. And you realize it's so expensive and so prohibitively, challenging to get it off the ground that you just never can. So the real question is like, why isn't there more innovation in this space? And I would say that it's because there's a massive mathematical science like really avoid. I don't think that it's a gap. I think what you see in this space is there's the sense that there are two pathways. You can go in a commercial direction, which is like going into embedding in a company. You're in that tech solutionist culture. You're given a very narrow problem. You're problem solving for profit. And then the other path is academia or government, where it's very ivory towered, or it's a lab and you're very focused on something in a particular field. State of the field, it's important innovation, but it's not related to impact and complexity. And there are a lot of norms, I think, in this field, which I have validated this with mathematicians. This is not just me bringing my assumptions, but you end up with really siloed experts. There's this sense that mathematicians work best when they're allowed to be geniuses, like they shouldn't be bogged down by sort of the societal drag, these systems that are just kind of an impediment to this like brilliant thinking and innovation. And then success really gets measured by these constrained metrics. So you're not looking at the entire system. There's not necessarily accountability for externality and the consequences of what gets designed. So there's a real need for expert impact trained mathematical scientists. And what this looks like is working as collaborative partners. So you're partnering across disciplines with scientists, with social scientists who have a hard problem, but don't necessarily have the tech to unlock that problem, or they have a solution, but they don't have the tech to unlock that solution. There's embedding in positive social practices and community, and like really understanding how society works and the sort of push-pull of different forces, particularly in wicked problems. And then success gets measured by social outcomes and like genuinely measured through research and trials in an accountable way. And what happens is you embed these collaborative, the collaborative mathematicians in impact innovation collaborations. So I can't actually see my slide here, but I'll move our little, okay, there. So it would be embedding a mathematician, which when you look at what Sarah and Gabe did for me, they started to step into, well, what are sex workers saying? What are clients saying? What are the trafficking concerns? They're looking at the whole landscape of the problem. It's very human-centered innovation, and you're always thinking about like, what is the community level in addition to what's the expert level as you're working through the R&D process, and you're working in service of communities and impact. So it's not just tech as like, we're achieving these for-profit goals, or this is just really cool. It actually has measurable value to society. Let's see if I can get my slide to change here. Okay, so now I'm going to walk you through, this is all getting me to items. So I hope that I've made the connection where you can see sort of where I came and where I came from, and why David Stern and I have ended up really seeing the same things and working together quite well, despite coming from such different backgrounds. I should say I was an English major, also history, and studied various other things, and I took lots of physics and chemistry and various other classes. So I did have some mathematical adjacent things, but I did not study math at all, and have much more of a humanities kind of social science side to me. So yes, so theory of change is what you see right now, and you can go out and you can find this pretty much everywhere. So you've got expert researchers, you've got global and local NGOs, and you've got community stakeholders. And you'll see that these people are already working in collaboration. But what they're missing is mathematical scientists. So when you're trying to develop tech right now, you're here and you're looking around and you're not finding anything that works. But if you add impact mathematical scientists, you start to be able to do a lot more. So you can develop scalable, actual innovative interventions. And then what you also see is that there's a lot of commonality across interventions. So if you're someone who's at the tech layer and not actually, working in the problem specifically, you can start to see there are patterns. Oh, this same need is across lots of different impact programs. And the goal here is really you're starting to build toward that collective intelligence exchange of information and iteration there's a lot of words in there, iteration of innovation for impact, and improving research, improving programming. And the big piece that's happening here, sorry, and I should have put this not as a side arrow, I'm looking at Tim's head, is that you're really collapsing power dynamics. So a lot of what happens right now, particularly with the way tech is designed, is you have an expert and community is just the beneficiary. Whereas what you really need is it starts to come like this. So you are really bringing it so that it's multi-directional. You can start to have community making sense of data, contributing to, what should be researched even, what a program should do, like, and that can happen at scale. And so, basically, sorry, this is a very wordy slide. We've been trying to capture what IDEMS is, so you're on this journey. I think we see, but really explaining to other people, what we see is that across these impact interventions, you really need kind of a collective intelligence suite of products, tools, infrastructure that are built for collaboration and underserved community inclusion and participation. And so the way we work is we run Collaboratories. So we partner with someone who's got something amazing, and I could ask Tim to speak about this because he kind of knows about one of them. But in fact, it's how I think it's how we got connected. Yeah. So so finding the researcher, finding the work that's just kind of blocked, where it just can't scale, it can't use tech, they see the potential. You work in collaborative applied research and development. Their clinical trials, I think it's really important, and something that I think we just don't see in tech. There's the whole culture of just like move fast, break things, which continues to be the culture. When really, particularly in impact, you need to not only make sure you're doing no harm, but is there evidence that this is actually moving the needle, that it's improving impact, that it's improving outcomes, and that it's having impact at scale. And then out of the collaboratories, what happens is that IDEMS ends up developing original innovation, like technology products that can be used in other places, which makes it a lot faster for the next project to get something off the ground, faster and more cost effective. So right now we're running Collaboratories in public health, and actually specifically in parenting, addressing child abuse and sexual violence, in agroecology, education, very focused on math education. IDEMS actually stands for, which I don't ever bring up, but innovations. Wait, I have to think about how it goes. Innovation in development, education, and the mathematical sciences. So David and Danny, who are the original founders of IDEMS, really came to this through math education. It's what they believe in most, of like, how do you, working in Africa in particular, in the lowest resource areas of Africa, how do you start to really develop like a next generation of really great mathematical minds? We also work in climate, and that's both unlocking climate data, but applying climate data. How do you make climate data available locally to build resilience in local communities where there's a lot of dependence, mostly, work is tied to weather and climate and the land. And then the final one, and this is our Topos collaboration, is around biodiversity. And we're looking at what would it look like to build a digital twin of Earth's biological layer. So you'll already see digital twin. Destination Earth is the EU's project right now, but what would it look like to actually map biodiversity and variable species, which sounds insane, but actually there are these really brilliant researchers who have built the models that can actually show the interplay of climate and resources and a species and within a whole ecosystem. And a lot of what we're working on is like, what is the technology that's needed to really unlock that at scale? And so how does the collaboratory work? I don't necessarily need to walk you through this whole diagram, but it is very much about embedding us in something that already happens. You see that it's a infinity loop as opposed to something that's just a series and you end somewhere. We're always iterating. There's always evolution. And yeah, there are these just ongoing collaborations. So just to take you kind of briefly through a collaboratory, and I'm really sorry for how much text is on these slides, but the collaboration we're running right now is, and actually has been running for a long time, is with Oxford's Global Parenting Initiative, and started with WHO, the World Health Organization, and UNICEF. And this NGO, it was originally a UNICEF NGO, but now it's been taken under the GPI, which is Parenting for Lifelong Health. It started in 2020. Actually, I think the researchers started a little earlier. And it's funded by the Lego Foundation. So, because as I mentioned before, getting funding for these projects is really difficult because, and actually I didn't talk about that so much, but I'll just bring it in here. There's a lot of precedence of impact gets funded and technology gets funded, but impact and technology don't get funded together. So IDEMS right now is doing a lot of kind of, we're just behind the scenes developing things, but aren't actually really getting paid expressly for that work. It's that we're kind of embedding that in the impact deliverables. But a lot of where we are right now is how do we start to fundraise for, we have proof of, what the solution is, what the tech is, this needs to be built out, it needs to scale, it needs to be more robust to really be able to be picked up and used easily. So that's a challenge for us right now, is really effectively fundraising to push us to that next level. This is addressing children at risk. It's really about child abuse, but also focusing, the relationship is around parenting and, what is the spectrum of abusive, violent to really, nurturing your child's best outcomes and developing them into being successful human beings and adults. And so it's this evidence-based parenting program, and it prevents childhood sexual violence, abuse, neglect. And the problem they have, or had, I should say, is that it's just prohibitively expensive. So it's $100 per family. You have significant customization required for the offline program. You need facilitators. There's so much that has to happen that's entirely human dependent for this to work. So this really was a big experiment, and there was a lot of skepticism. Can we do something with tech and make this work? And what you see, I'm just going to bring this in here, is that actually the Collaboratory ends up replicating a lot of the structure of a startup. So Jamie, Dr. Jamie Laughlin, is the head of the GPI. He really is the person who holds this whole thing together. You see him just like playing that kind of CEO role. David is the CTO. He brings all the technology thinking. Lucy is all about measuring impact, research trials, like really collecting that data. Esme on our team is the head of the application layer, and I'll get into the product, but there's sort of different layers of the technology within this whole intervention. So Esme heads that from our team. Kiara on our team heads the chatbot. And then the real kicker in all of this is Lori, who works for Parenting and Lifelong Health, has this global network and is basically, in a startup, you would have the role of, well, how do we scale this? How do we sell it? How do we get new business? Lori is out there totally through her own networks, just constantly, pitching this, telling people what's going on. And so everyone kind of gets to focus on what they're great at. And together, the collaboration kind of supercharges innovation, impact, all these things in a way that if just IDEMS was trying to do this, or just Lori was trying to do it, it wouldn't be possible. You need all of the collaborators working together. And not on this slide are all kinds of local teams, local researchers, local community organizations around the world. So this is in multiple countries. I will say, in the case of this, we think about community just for the sake of making this manageable. At this stage, communities at the country level. So we're really dividing things out by the country level. It's not that in the future you couldn't, move down to more grassroots community, but at this stage, you have to be kind of realistic about what's possible. So the big problems we're looking at that they looked at when we entered this was, how do you protect the core evidence base? There's a program that works, but allow for local adaptation and customization that makes it locally relevant. How can global experts in collaboration with local communities assess and make sense of data? How can they actually start to develop multi-directional innovation sharing, best practice sharing, so you could have communities sharing with each other? You can also have communities pushing best practices back up to the expert team where they see things happening. And I will say, well, I won't get ahead of myself. I started to tell you, leap into the future, but I won't do that yet. And then how do you start to establish local ownership and, really give communities a sense of autonomy over what they're using, the way it works. And we already see this happening, is that at the country level, you see countries really starting to take this and run with it. But again, I get ahead of myself. Out of this, we have two core innovations which need to be renamed, which are Open App Builder and Open Chat Builder. And they're really allowing for local versioning, protecting that core evidence base, but with really user-friendly, simple technology. So you don't actually need to be skilled as a coder in any way. It's all through Sheets. You can have communities begin to adapt for their local context what this looks like, and drive innovation. And actually, I will say, right now, we're getting to the point where you see these really complex data sets. And I was on a call yesterday where I was like, oh, Topos should be on this call, where it was about how do you bring data that hasn't been collected in the same spaces, has maybe had variable, people making sense of it. How do you bring that into some sort of cohesive system? So out of this collaboration, you see all kinds of variations that start to emerge. So parent app and parent text, those were two variations. You have local innovation, which is a facilitator app, which specifically trains facilitators. That's out of, I think, Malaysia. Crisis text emerged from Ukraine and Palestine, that parenting in a war zone is very different from parenting other places. So what people need is actually quite different. And then you have these other variations that have emerged from very specific contexts. The last one, the audio example, was specifically for Rohingya refugees who often don't even have literacy. So how do you make this available to them when they can't actually read anything? And we're just starting to get to results. This is a really patient, long collaboration. So it's been 6 years of really this deep collaboration, making sure, trialing that this is, genuinely delivering impact, that it's ethical, that it's responsible. And so there was this big trial that was just completed, and we're really seeing like incredible results. I will just highlight, I think these results are still, they're not actually fully published. So I said to Tim, hopefully I'm not revealing anything that's not public yet. We'll have to censor this part of the video if so. But really a huge thing. So we went from $100 per family to $5.98 per family. There's a 92% user retention rate after 14 months, which, I mean, in tech terms would be incredibly enviable. And this is really driving offline best behaviors, not the app. It's not designed to keep people in the app. It's like, how do you have better relationships within your family? So you see that, the incentive toward being your best offline self and being the best parent in that context actually is something that people want. They just want it because obviously it's like a better life that you're living. And crazy statistic, which is like 57% retained reduction in sexual violence against girls, 11% reduction in child abuse. There are some other stats that come out of it. But Lucy in her presentation said, we've done something truly breakthrough. And I think she was the one on the front lines of making the case for doing this when there was so much skepticism. This can't be done with technology. It's impossible. And so really proving that when you build out the tech to support this and build it the right way, really different things are possible. And I think that's my last slide. Yeah, how did I do? Oh, I did well. That was perfect. Okay.
You leave yourself unmuted.
Oh yeah, unmuted? Yeah. Oh yeah, okay, perfect.
Thank you very much, Kate. That was a wonderful talk. If people can hear me. We've got 10 minutes left for questions. So if anybody has any questions, then you can either pop them in the chat, you can raise your hand, you can unmute yourself, you can do anything you like. Dana has already put his hand up. So Dana, what's your question?
My question is about anonymous payments. Of course, described was very difficult on multiple factors, but are there other areas where anonymous payments are useful and needed for reasons of some kind of privacy? Are there other areas?
Yeah, I think that is a social question about cash. So I think there are people who think there's no role for cash in society anymore. I would argue that is not the reality. I also think, I mean, it's always the case of, there are people who will make the case of, well, you don't need, if you don't have anything to hide, why do you need privacy? Which of course is just not, it's not how the world works, especially when your data is being collected. So I think when you go out into the world and you ask people, there are lots of places, and particularly among low resource communities, where people are often punished by, I have a very good friend who was one of the early employees for Venmo. And, you basically can get punished for just like who's in your community. So if you live in a zip code that has been identified as a problematic zip code by the system, then you also suffer. You join this system and you participate in it. You want to make payments, but you're going to not have access to the same privileges. You're more easily blocked and banned. You might have to jump through more hoops. So I think what you see the moment you get out of high resource contexts is there's a lot of kind of arbitrary technical punishment of people and institutional punishment. And so when you talk to people who are poorer, there's a sense of like, I don't want to participate in that system. So that would be my answer. And I would say here, I spent so long kind of fending off the cryptocurrency nut jobs enthusiasts, where there's just this like real belief, like, well, they just need crypto. But actually, when you look at people who are working in sex work, no, they need to pay their rent. They need something that's not, speculative. They need to know that if they put this money in the bank today, it's going to be worth exactly the same thing when they have to pay their rent in a month. It's all of these things where it's really different when you're not gambling. This is really just like you are living on the margins.
Thanks. Kevin, you have your hand up.
Thanks a lot, Kate. That's really remarkable results in the study that maybe you just broke embargo on or whatever.
Hope not.
How can you even do a randomized study where you have results like, oh, half the sexual abuse is gone now? That seems like the kind of thing where you're like, oh, sorry, we cut it off after 3 months because it was suddenly unethical to even keep going. What was it? I mean, maybe the control group is not
this is, and I would say this is the point of these collaborations. I don't know the answer to that, but I know these are the answer would be that these are career researchers where they have done, like, literally, Lucy and Jamie, I don't know how old they are. Let's just say they're somewhere in their 40s. They have, 20 plus years, 40 years between them of researching, developing research methods, so I think like the whole point is that we're not the ones who have to figure out what that is. We just, they're the ones running those trials. And I will say, having been on the call, it is a village of people who are involved in this, where it is like a really, you have so many people who are involved in different ways to begin to unlock this data. Sorry, I can't give you like the specific.
No, sure. I was particularly thinking in terms of at least what in the States we have these IRBs for human, yeah, but right. So you've got this incredibly diverse collaboration, which is amazing. And we'd love to be able to emulate some of that over here.
Thanks. Valeria, you have your hand up.
Hi, Kate. That was impressive. Thank you so much for kind of a very landscape of different issues that one needs to deal with. But I'm kind of I recognize some of my concerns in lots of things that you said. But one of the things that I think I would like to hear more about is kind of how to kind of connect with the communities themselves. Because you don't want to just kind of, as you say, we're not about solutionism. We don't want to kind of hand in something done by your Oxford experts. So kind of how do you kind of organize this business of actually getting to know the communities and gaining their trust? Because that is the hard thing, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think what I now recognize, so from my work on Horizontl, I can see why it's not for an entrepreneur. Like the amount of time and the slow, steady work, and it was like, for me, there were moments where I made great leaps forward. Where when I met my head of community, the person who eventually became that role, she kind of became my guide through, like, when I was with her, I could access things that I could never have accessed, where it's like, you're getting this shorthand kind of access to trusted relationships. And even then, I would say I don't think that I would ever, I would never be brought into certain circles and certain conversations, which is why you do need to give community spaces where they can actually work through stuff. But I guess, the answer to that is, you are never going to build all those relationships yourself. It's always going to be, who are the people who you can find who are just kind of the gateway. So when you get to GPI, then you start to access, they have this network of researchers, of, other experts who are working on these problems, often very grassroots working on these problems. So you have from a local university or something who's also interested. And then when you look at the reason you have an NGO partner or local organizations, is those people have a totally different kind of relationship where they're actually at the delivery level. It's not research. It's how do we get programs out? So they'll have a lot of community relationships with, like, delivery organizations. And then those delivery organizations are the ones that have all of the direct relationships with communities. So you're never actually assuming that you as this researcher are going to leapfrog to having all of those relationships. And so it is about building those collaborations where different people really hold deep relationships and knowledge in their domain.
Right. That sounds good, but it also makes it kind of much harder to do the second half of the stuff that you were saying about, which is kind of extracting the commonality of the issues, right? Kind of extracting the bits that happen for different problems in different communities and stuff. But yeah, no, kind of impressive work. Thanks very much for coming and talking to us. Yeah.
Thank you.
And there's one question in the chat, which I will read out, which says, I would love to hear Kate expand on the human cost of the issues with data governance. I've been working with data for 15 years and am intimately aware of the problems with data quality and governance, most recently environmental, social, and governance reporting. However, I think the problems raised in this talk are of even more importance. How can people like me, data at scale experts, help?
Oh, God. So I'm not going to be the person to specifically answer this. I know there are people on our team who would have very clear answers for you. This gets a bit into, like, again, domain expertise that I don't necessarily have. I would say that one of the things that we are working on very deeply, and something that we are hoping to raise money to start to develop, is, like, how do you make it a lot easier for local stakeholders to analyze their own, to clean, to analyze, to apply their data locally and contribute to, like, what happens to that data? Because I think what happens right now is you have data scientists, you have people who are working at a certain level who are trying to make sense of really complex data sets, complex, data that even, I think, again, I'm not going to speak to this brilliantly, but I think even cleaning data involves decisions. And so this is what I've learned from our team, is like, well, actually, when you're cleaning the data at the local level, you don't necessarily need to discard something, or, they can see, like, oh, this was a totally valid entry. It's just, they use the local way of entering data or whatever it is. So I think a lot of it is, how do you start to, again, like, so much of this is about collaboration, where you're enabling people who, like, for you to dive into some small local community data set is an insane waste of your time. But for someone who lives in that community to dive into that data set, that's a great use of their time. And so how do you start to let that person do that work, but tether that to the systems you're working on, and make all of that kind of work in complement, which I think is sort of what Topos is thinking about. Yeah, so I don't know if that's a helpful answer to your question, but I could point you to people on our team who could give you way better answers.
Okay, thank you. Are there any more questions? We've probably got time for one very brief one. I think not. This seems delightful. So thank you again, Kate.
Thanks for having me.
Talk.
Thanks.
Thank you to everyone in the audience.
Thank you.
And then, sorry, so normally we just hang around for a few minutes.